Good morning, everybody. How are you today? My name is Dan O'Connor. I am the Field Operations Division Director for the Chief Security Officer for FEMA. Nabeela?
Hey, good morning. Nabeela Barbari with OTH Solutions as of recent, but was with the Department of Homeland Security for several years before then.
Hi, good morning. My name is Stephen Sun. I was formerly with the United States Capitol Police. I was the chief of the United States Capitol Police. Prior to that, I was 25 years with the Washington, D.C. Police. Honored to be back among my peers here. Thank you.
Patriotism is a pejorative in the United States in the 21st century. And I think it's gotten that way for a variety of reasons. It's a dynamic conversation. It's a personal conversation. It's a passionate conversation. And each one of us has a unique perspective because all of our orientations are based on the totality of who we are, the people we interact with, where we're from, what we do. And the United States currently, we're amusing ourselves to death. We are consumed with triviality, and we are consumed with things that don't have the gravitas and the substance that an emerging 21st century power has to deal with. So we're finding ourselves being consumed with activities and comments that are, for any number of reasons, both driven by our desire to consume and our consumption being provided by an accelerating and amplifying information cycle. And what we believe, what we know, what we think we know is being attacked, shaped, and perhaps destroyed right before our eyes. So some interesting information to shape kind of the context. When you talk to Americans by generation, 73% of the baby boomers are proud to be Americans and live in the country. 54% of Generation X have the same point of view. Millennials are 36%, and Gen Z is at 16%. So not sure how the data was captured or how they shaped it, but we have an existential problem that perhaps we can start a conversation with respect and not tolerance. They're two different things, and like Heather said, words do matter. So we're going to pose some questions. We're going to have a conversation. I would strongly encourage every one of you to challenge every one of us with your point of view. We want to make this a really robust dialogue. I don't know if it's necessarily a right answer, but there are points of view. And that's what makes diamonds brilliant, right? So many facets, just the way the light hits it and it shines. So there are brilliant people in here from different points of view, different walks of life, different experiences. And we want to share some of those things and what we've talked about and what we want to examine. So one of the things that I think makes American patriotism unique is our documents. The Constitution is a brilliant document, not because it was written by brilliant people. It was written by imperfect people in an imperfect time, like all things are. But they built it so that it can be changed. What other documents in the world have the ability to be changed based on the needs and desires of the people? And it's always been about the people in the United States. So when you go back through the document, we hold these truths self-evident, that all men are created equal and that their Creator endows them with certain unalienable rights. Those among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That was the first revolutionary shot across the bow, that individualism was more important than the crown, and that the crown, being Britain, saw that as a massively disloyal act and in self-indulgence. And you take that and you pull that forward into the 21st century, and I think that is the existential question that we're starting to face, is we have people telling other people that they're not patriots, and patriots telling patriots that they're not patriotic enough. and that your individual rights, your individual liberties, the things that every one of your forefathers, whether first generation, second, fourth, eighth, or 11th, understood innately that this is the only place in the world in history that you have the opportunity to fulfill a prophecy of yourself, your destiny. The American dream, it came up a couple of times. Again, that's another self-defined, what does that mean to people? These are challenging times, not because necessarily this is the first time. We'll have lots of opportunity to share how this is a theme, but it is a theme that has followed the United States in our ascension. The more powerful the United States gets, the more fearful it gets. It is an epic paradox. We face a time in our country where the world is telling us that cosmopolitanism and being a person of the world is more important than necessarily being a person of the tribe. And then the inverse to that is the extreme nationalism and jingoism that emerges when people are afraid. So these are some of the things we'd like to talk about. We have some questions we're going to ask one another and just kind of kick off the dialogue. Again, there's no right answers, and I think it's really difficult to have an expectation that this will be anything less than a conversation, but could be anything more than the start of a different conversation. And we are here to provoke that. You know, provocation is the key to all change, right? So, when you talk about defining patriotism, what does patriotism mean to you? Think of that individually and collectively, but when you realize there's different patriotism definitions and perspectives, how do you define patriotism, or when did you realize that your definition and my definition may be different? And what was a seminal moment in your life that you recognized that patriotism could be different for different things? And I'm going to start with Nabeela to kind of unpack that as she sees fit.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks. Good morning again, everyone. So first, I want to just give a shout out to 1403, 1404, the wild and wonderful West Virginia. That was my cohort. And then thanks to Heather, of course, because we are all here because of her endless commitment to making sure that CHDS is the gift that keeps on giving. So thank you for that. So I think I have a couple, well, I know I have a couple thoughts, and I'm going to try to manage them all. But the Dr. Kiernan, who I think we all had the pleasure of meeting at some point in our life, used the term in our cohort, pracademic, and I think that part of, for some reason, that simple word has stuck with me this whole time. So yeah, 15 years at Department of Homeland Security, but a lifelong learner of patriotism because of who I am, where I came from, and being a recipient of national security policy in many ways over the last several years. And then my most recent position was at the White House National Security Council, where I worked. My critical infrastructure and law enforcement engagement background was helpful, but it was helping enhance the security of the National Capital Region that definitely came to light during my time there. So, but what I define as patriotism is something that I reevaluate for myself. To say it's like daily is probably an overstatement, but to say it's less than weekly is an understatement. It is something that has stuck with me endlessly, you know, and I think even every morning when I figure out where I'm going to get coffee from, although I've recently switched to tea, so God help me, you know, I hear Dave and Anders in my head. They're like, oh, you chose 7-Eleven today. Oh, you chose Starbucks today. What does that say about your in-group? Did you go to Phil's Coffee? What does that say about your in-group? So there's literally not a day that goes by where I don't think and rethink and overthink about the decisions I'm making and what that says about my identity group. So the real question is, where are you from? Well, I'm from Northern Virginia, outside Washington, D.C. But where are you from? So that's the from. And there's a couple people in here that know the from. Y'all got the from. I know you know what the from is. And so my from is Palestinian. I'm a Palestinian American. I'm a first generation, I'm hyphenated. We'll get to that later. I'm a hyphenated American, but why? I don't know, because I'm from Washington, D.C. But I have to be hyphenated because my name is really weird. And I look a little different. and I certainly sound a lot different. So my from is that I'm a first-generation Palestinian American. My family came here documented, we'll get to that point later, in ways that are no longer legal. So I can't say to someone, well, just come here the way I came here, because you can't anymore, because our immigration law doesn't allow for it. My mom's family came here after the '48 war by joining the military, which got them citizenship, and my dad's side came here after the '67 war, which through family connections, which again, both of those are no longer legal means to entry and citizenship in the U.S. But I was fortunate enough to grow up in a metropolitan area where eating hummus for lunch at school was actually kind of cool before it was $10.99 a pound at Whole Foods. It was just a thing we ate. And so that was a great thing for me. So I was privileged in that way, and I didn't know my privilege. But I bet y'all can imagine when I learned I was privileged. It was this date after 9/11. When suddenly my from was not cool, and my eating hummus at lunch was not normal. And so that's when things really started to change. Literally the day of 9/11, I went to work, and my friend, use that term loosely now, said to me, now would be a good time for you to go by Maria. Cool, thanks. So I definitely, things changed after that. The nuance of being from Palestine didn't matter. The nuance that I am Christian didn't matter, because, newsflash, y'all know what I'm going to say if you're in 1403, 1404. Jesus wasn't born in Kentucky. Religion is a choice. And so being a Christian Palestinian, the nuance that I wasn't Saudi Arabian didn't matter, especially where I was living at the time in the middle of Virginia. And then, it started to exponentially grow from there when I realized my in-group, out-group dynamic became even more complicated when I chose a field in government. And I wanted to not go into advocacy, not go to the State Department, not do acceptable women, Middle Eastern things that you do when you work in government. You should go into advocacy or USAID. Don't get me wrong, those jobs are admirable and they're really hard. I didn't want to do them, that was too hard. So I went into security, which joke's on me, right? At the time, the group was called the National Protection and Programs Directorate, now the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. Nitin Natarajan is the director over there, deputy director. And so, yeah, joke's on me, but my in-group, which was my Palestinian American community, was like, oh, you're a traitor now, cool, we got it. And then the government was looking at me like, oh, you're gonna take a year and a half to get your clearance. So there's definitely a point in my life where I didn't really know what patriotism meant to me. Now I realize that I don't disagree with the term patriotism or nationalism. What I challenge and what I have concerns about is how we operationalize it and who's allowed to be patriotic and who's allowed to be nationalist, and when they can be those things. So I will leave it there, but I suspect a lot of those things I just triggered will come back up shortly.
You see, that's the uniqueness of the panel we're on. So I come probably a little bit more of a traditional background, been here for many generations, come from Norway. Yeah, don't make any fun of us for lutefisk. But anyway, I come from a military family. So my definition of patriotism kind of comes, it was helped shaped by my dad. My dad was a B-52 pilot. So growing up, my level of patriotism, my definition of patriotism was really an affection and love of a country I'd seen my dad sacrifice to defend. An appreciation for that country, for a willingness to look out for its well-being. That's part of the reason I'd seen what my dad had done. I wanted to go into policing, and that's what kind of drove me. One of the reasons I went into policing, because I wanted to feel a service for my country, service for my community, which was important for me to do. I think you talk about how your seminal moment was 9/11. For me, my seminal moment too was 9/11. I went to work one day. I was a lieutenant with Washington, D.C. Police. Went there and went up to my planning office, and someone said, hey, the White House is on the phone for you. Picked up the phone. We handled the presidential escorts. We handled all the events over there. And it was a special agent by the name of Steve Woodard from the United States Secret Service. I've known him for a while. Sadly, he just passed away a little while ago. But anyway, he had just become aware. I was looking up at the news of the first plane that had hit one of the two Twin Towers. And he asked me, what do you think? My dad being a pilot, blue skies outside, I said, I don't know, Steve, I'm a little concerned. As we're talking, the second plane hits the second tower. He says, we're calling an emergency meeting at the White House. I had to talk to Chief Ramsey briefly, handle a couple other things. Meanwhile, we had another plane hit the Pentagon. Next thing I know, I found myself running into the old executive office building, which is right next to the White House, to come up with the plan for how we're going to try and secure the 18 acres, the White House complex. Was in the city for 3 days. When I finally got a chance to drive home, I was driving a marked police car, drove home into Northern Virginia, and as I drove home, I passed bridge after bridge with American flags, corners of people standing on them waving American flags, saying thank you. That helped shape my patriotism. It reaffirmed my patriotism, my service to my country. You had Congress, a bipartisan, and maybe one of the last times they actually got together and did something, stand on the steps of the Capitol and sing the national anthem. Not as nice of a version as we had this morning, but sing the national anthem. And that meant a lot. So 9/11, that's what we have. But today, you talk about, kind of where we are today. We were the United States of America. Now we seem to be the divided states of America. You have all these different narratives out there. And I didn't think it was as low as 16% for Gen Z, but when you go online, and I know you're going to talk about the ills of social media, when you go online and you look at, some of these college students talking about America and some of these college students talking about on TV, talking about the evils and how bad America is. I understand, that there comes a point we have to identify and, correct our sins of a past. But this is a hell of a country, and when I sit there and I see that, I think to myself just how dangerous that is. The rhetoric that they're spouting off, the stuff you're starting to hear on social media, how this is percolating up to a society. And then when you have some people in high-level positions start to push it down, and I know we'll talk about it later, but when you have the president go on and do his speech in September, vilifying a political opponent using their patriotic slogan, "Make America Great Again," and turning it into a fascist statement, it becomes very dangerous. So I find that very concerning, especially when I think about what Reagan used to say. Freedom is just one generation away from extinction. So when you look at Generation Z being 16%, that's scary. And all of us here as leaders, that's something, as I look around the room, that's something we're all going to have to deal with because concerning, that's our future.
Everybody has, you look around the room and I'm watching people's eyes well up because they care. And they care in a way that is individual. And clearly 9/11 was a seminal one, but mine is much more simplistic, or at least as a younger person. So I was born in Queens, New York, grew up in Long Island, and in my neighborhood on the block, Albanian Muslims, first generation Portuguese, people from all walks of life, every day interfaced, people that my mom knew that I ended up working for had tattoos on their forearms, and they had survived the Holocaust. So Jews, Gentiles, Christians, Muslims, everybody together, not knowing any different but to love one another because we were familial. That was our local tribe. It was us against the world, block by block, typical New York shtick. Everybody's kind of got their thing. And then having World War I vets that lived in the neighborhood, which is pretty astounding when you look at it retroactively, is, you're 6, 7 years old, and there are people who fought in Bella Wood, and most of your neighbors were World War II vets and Korean vets. And the Vietnam vets were starting to move through the neighborhood, and we're getting older, and we're starting to sense these things, and understanding that between my wife's family and mine, every single conflict that the United States have had, we have been part of, right? So there's a military aspect. Both my brothers are in law enforcement in New York, so we kind of touch a lot of things. And I remember some Iranian kids showing up about 1979, and paying attention, watching the world, watching things unfold. We're watching Afghanistan, we're watching the Soviets, it's post-Vietnam, and then you're watching what's happened in Iran, and the one girl sitting next to me, and her name's Azita, and she doesn't stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, which is unfathomable in our disposition, our point of view. It's part of every day, and we take it so for granted until we reflect on what that means. And so her name ended with N, mine was O, so I sat next to her in homeroom for a couple of years, and one day I watched a group of seniors tear her brother to shreds because he was Iranian. And I couldn't process the why, because I grew up with all these people. Why? Don't you know what we're about? Don't you understand that your parents came here as Hungarian refugees after World War I, and now you're beating the shit out of some kid because they're not like you? And I got this unbelievably innate understanding of how powerful fear really is, and we were afraid of people that were different than us. So you process that information and you watch it, and then you slowly start to see the greatness of the United States and America, because it's a mutual relationship. You know, you start learning a little bit of Farsi, and they laugh at you when you speak, and she's learning English, and we're just talking back and forth, and one day she stands for the Pledge of Allegiance. That's pretty powerful stuff. So then you take that, you take those experiences, and you take that patriotic fervor. I was laughing, you know, John and I were talking last night, John Comiskey, you know, good quality Irish moms in New York. They'll wrap you before they love you, but it's all the same thing. And my mother beating into my head, never clap after the Star Spangled Banner, it's disrespectful. And of course, why? Just because mom said, right? And all of these things, and this is, you know, we're not a soup, we're not a stew, we're not a mixing bowl. We're us. We are a unique experiment that has stood the test of our time, but now we're under some duress. So what kind of people are we actually? Are we committed to Nabeela and Steve and all of your individual point of views? And what's the expectation of us, and what was the expectation of those who came before us? So that was one of the undergirding themes of our previous conversations, and some of the things we started to write. Under great fear, almost everyone becomes superstitious. And if you're superstitious, you will then become very tribal. And if you become tribal, you will attack those that are not in your herd. And I then started to kind of go through our history, and forgive me, or at least indulge me, for these are the list of activities that have taken place in the last 100 years with regards to America's fear. The Overman Committee, the Defense Securities Act, the Espionage Act, the Sedition Act, the Immigration Act, the Volstead Act, the Bonus Army riots, the Fish Committee, the Dyes Committee, the Yellow Report, Japanese internment, the McCormick Committee, the McCarran International Security Committee, HUAC, Committee for Public Information, the emergence of eugenics, COINTELPRO, and then, of course, the Patriot Act. How can the United States be the United States and be so afraid of everybody else? And that was kind of one of the themes that we really started talking about the psychological and physical impacts of fear. So, you know, I'd ask Steve, why do you think people being different and having a different definition of patriotism is so unnerving and so fearful?
Well, I'd say when you have people begin to develop a different level of definition of patriotism, I think it begins to make people maybe fearful that there may be, you know, ulterior motives behind that. You know, as we begin to see the divisions that we're seeing form out there in social media within the country, I think the different levels and different definitions, I think will strike fear into some, especially when you see people in the media and society really beginning to push identity politics, and that begins to push a lot of people into what their definition of politics is. I think that begins to raise more of a concern, because they're concerned that what makes America strong is now being whittled away through these definitions of these various definitions of what is patriotism. When you look at it, we are a melting pot. E pluribus unum. That's the great experiment that is the United States of America. Think about it. 246 years old. We have a very concerning history when you look at what goes on and how different divisions began. Look at 1861, the beginning of the Civil War. What was going on prior to the Civil War? You're seeing all these divisions coming up. They're using media. The politicians we're beginning to push different narratives through the media and develop this divisive environment that was leading into the Civil War. You see that. I don't know if you mentioned the what was it under Truman, the Loyalty Doctrine?
The Loyalty Act, yeah.
Yeah, the Loyalty Act, part of the National Security Act. I think it was 1947. That begins to go down and target people that are not seeing patriotism maybe the same way you are. So it raises a concern, because along with this identity politics, you begin to get pushed away from what really makes, in my view, America great. It's the you have various ethnicities, various cultures that come together and create this melting pot. Yet we bring, values and loyalty as we all come together as Americans. When we don't share that same view of what it means to come together as Americans, we get to be pushed. We find ourselves being pushed toward a very divisive environment. That's tribalism. And we see, when you look overseas, over Europe, the Balkans, you see tribalism and tribal societies don't succeed. So I think maybe there's a level of fear associated with the various type of definitions of patriotism you're seeing.
How about you, Nabeela?
Can I skip this one? No, I'm just kidding. Okay, well, I feel like, no, I'm being facetious. So, yeah, so to suggest that there's an alternative method of patriotism suggests that there's a standard method of patriotism. And so that mere principle, I'd argue, right? Who's to say what is the right form of patriotism? When I was a kid, we lived in Virginia, church was in DC, and every Sunday my dad would take the long way home, and we would drive by the Capitol because he wanted to see who was protesting what. That man did not understand one bit of what anybody was protesting about anything, but it did not matter to him. What he cared about was that we got to witness that in this country, you could go and protest an action and a decision of the government and still be a part of the country and go home safely. That's what he cared about. That's what patriotism meant to me. My dad still cries when he hears the national anthem, although now he cries for slightly different reasons, which is upsetting in itself. But, I guess the psychological impact, I think I'm hearing and feeling a lot of this history, like this talk about history. And I don't know when that date is. When are we starting and when are we ending this history discussion? The Indian Termination Act was not so long ago. Japanese internment, which you mentioned, not so long ago. I left government 4 months ago and started a business, or I joined a business, started another one, it's a long story. My point is, when I was born, I was not legally allowed, or I should rephrase it this way. When I was born, the bank that I got my loan from could have denied me my business loan because I didn't have a man co-signer. That law was only passed in 1988. So when I think about patriotism, yes, I am a brown woman. I am from Palestine. Yes, I'm also a woman who, until 1974, wasn't allowed to get a credit card without daddy or husband's signature on it. So this argument of history is not so far back, right? I also flag that the sins of our past, I guess we can have a philosophical debate about sins, but the past is not so past. The fear comes from after 9/11, I was cleared by the Department of Homeland Security for, like I said, 15 years. Yet when I traveled to the Caribbean for vacay one year and I came back, I had Quad S on my boarding pass. Anybody here know what Quad S? If you got 4 S's, one person here knows what that is. Not shading anybody, I'm just saying there's a reason why no one else in this room knows what Quad S means on your boarding pass. It means that you are pulled out for a special secondary screening that doesn't exist. And you may be on a list that doesn't exist, right? But yet the agency that pulled me out for Quad S screening was the same one that was holding my active TS clearance. That is fear. NSEERS program. Anybody heard of NSEERS? No, it's another you don't count. It's the National Security Entry and Exit Program that people who look like Muslims and may be Muslims were forced to register in after 9/11. And it wasn't until 2016 that that program was finally abolished after 0 convictions and hundreds of $millions were spent implementing that program. Executive Order 13769. Anybody in the room? Anybody in the room? Nope. And that's, yeah, you? Good, great. So that was people called it the Muslim ban, right? That was the ban. If you are from a certain country, you have to do a special registration and you have to go through a special screening in which over 1,300 people were put on a deportation list. So the sins of our past may not be so past. So I would just offer that is something to think about. And I guess the other fear is, and I think I mentioned this earlier, actually I know I did, when I mentioned the who's allowed to protest and show patriotism and how. So Standing Rock, people know Standing Rock, it was in North Dakota, right, the pipeline, there was several thousand, maybe 30,000 protesters there. Generally, there's been very little reporting to suggest that that was anything other than peaceful protests. And they got tear gassed and they got rubber bulleted and pelleted and shut down pretty quickly. Less than a year later, Charlottesville, Unite the Right rally, where you had armed Nazis, right, semi-automatic weapons, self-identified Nazis, neo-Nazis, were calling for things not so peaceful. And that was protected. So look, that's a position, it's a perspective, not saying it's the only one, not saying it's the right one, but Standing Rock versus Charlottesville is definitely something that we could talk about when we talk about how does the psychological impact of protecting our country, protecting the First Amendment. The Bill of Rights was about state rights, and we're trying to force them into individual rights. And I wonder how that's going for us right now. I don't know.
And those are great points, and you had brought up in previous conversations the what ifs. What if the overwhelming majority of people that were at the Capitol were people of color? What would the outcome have been? It's a hypothetical question. We have times throughout our history that we have answers. Look at Tulsa, look at other things, look at certain behaviors in terms of the NRA in California and the Black Panther Party trying to arm themselves to protect themselves and then becoming criminalized. So there's all these things, and you want to try to be as objective as you can, of course recognizing that none of us are truly objective. We all have our biases, and those are formed by who we are, where we come from, etc. But the fact remains is our rights are universal. They're not based on who you are, who you know, what you do, what you believe. You know, the Pledge of Allegiance was written by a socialist. God Bless America was written by a socialist. This Land Is Your Land was written by Arlo Guthrie. He was a communist. But come forward, 25 years, and these are really profound, great songs that are representative of America. And God We Trust was not placed in the Pledge of, Under God was not placed in the Pledge of Allegiance till 1953. And, why was that? And there's always the why, the why, the why, the why. And it still comes back to fear and power. So you have this altruistic point of view that patriotism is a very individual love, and it's an interface with the idealized version of what America can be versus the power and politics of patriotism, where we coerce certain sets of behavior and punish other behaviors because we want to streamline and switch from that patriotic point of view into that jingoist nationalist point of view where it's my country right or wrong, but they forget the second half of that verse, and those who don't comply are punished. Not so long ago, but conscientious objectors used to be beat and just thrown in prisons because they didn't believe philosophically and religiously that they should go to war. So you see, on the one hand, the United States is vastly different in terms of understanding civil liberties, their First Amendment rights, their Fourth Amendment rights, their rights to due process. but how quick can they evaporate in the event of a fearful act? And that leads into the next part of the conversation. The United States has really cool assimilation theology. You know, we're all just one country, we're all the mixing bowl, you know, in pluribus unum, which is a really awesome Latin thing, but it was designed because it had 13 letters for the 13 colonies. Everything's a stick. America is amazing at marketing. They've been marketing this stuff for a while. But in the theme, we all become one. And without a focusing event, we become one of one. So is there an expectation that we have to assimilate into Nabeela's point, the right definition of patriotism? And why are we the only country that even embraces hyphenated Americanism? Like, what is that? You go to other countries and they go, oh, you're American. They said, no, I'm an Irish American. I'm a Palestinian American. I'm a Norwegian American. I'm a something American. And they've been having this conversation about the hyphen for a long time, but it's unique to the United States because you have feet in both worlds. Recently, there was a lot of conversation about the illegal immigrants coming across the border, making all their money, shipping it back over, and we're losing all that revenue. But that was the entire way that most of the immigration was paid for of the Irish during the potato famine, was people that came to this country, made money, and sent it back home to bring their relatives. And then those same Irish, you know, a couple generations later, end up running Tammany Hall. So it's all part of the bigger conversation. But if you can't embrace the reality of the conversation and you only have that one very small view, you're missing out on the greatness of America, and we are limiting ourselves in a very hyper-competitive world. So what do you think about hyphenated Americans, my Palestinian friend?
Palestinian American. Look, I'm not, I would love to live in my country, note to self, this country, that wasn't a thing. I don't hyphenate myself by choice. I hyphenate myself, I argue, because I live in a country that requires me to. The U.S. Census requires that we choose an ethnicity. We choose a race. Don't get me started on the difference between race and ethnicity. That is a whole separate issue that we could debate about. You should write a paper on it, Dan. I'm sure Heather's taking a note right now for it. So Middle East and North Africa, it's been a debate for that to be on the census, for example, for years, right? Why does it even matter? Why does it matter if I have to check the white box or not? It matters because that decides how federal funds are distributed. It matters how your roads are built, how your schools are funded, how much grant money you get for colleges and state-level universities. It matters that the health and public health services for people that get to check a box, how they get funded. So it matters. I didn't decide that. I would love for that thing to be gone and we all could just be treated equally. But until we are all treated equitably, it is hard for us to speak out of both sides. Which one do we want? Do we want to check a box that says I'm hyphenated? Or do I want to check a box that says I'm American and I'm happy to be here and I'd like to just move on with my life? We're just not at that point yet. The American experiment is, it's a funny thing, right? So Steve, I think you just mentioned the social media thing, which I'm sure will come out, but in that toxic echo chamber called Twitter, after the Super Bowl, was it 2 weeks ago, I guess, the certain congressional representatives really liked to find their little niche and find their stakeholder group and their funding base and talk about the atrocity of the Black national anthem being sung. And I was like, oh, here we go. This is interesting to me. So, the fact that we have two national anthems, right? God, that argument is really brutal. I offer that as a discussion here. Like, do we have two national anthems? Right? It's a very convenient narrative to say that we have two national anthems and we're trying to create a more divisive nation, when the reality is, Lift Every Voice and Sing was actually written after the 1896 Plegison, I'm saying his name wrong, and Ferguson decision that separate but equal would remain. So there was a hymn written by a man named James Weldon Johnson in 1900 that was turned later, it was a poem, later turned into a hymn sung in churches, Christian churches, right? And it was about equality, right? He was fighting, you know, we look forward to liberation. I'm going to spare you all my singing voice because I'm not Velvet, who's a rock star, by the way, and won't sing it for you now. But I raise that as an important part of the discussion and the narrative and the convenient narratives that are being perpetuated right now. Lift Every Voice and Sing was written 100 years before the Star-Spangled Banner was officially named our national anthem, and in large part because there's a phrase, a section of that poem that was taken out because it was calling for fear for the Black Americans who were serving in the war to don't you even think about leaving Fort McHenry and joining the British on their boats because we will find you. Right? So after that was taken out, then it became the national anthem. So look, again, another perspective, but the hyphenated American, until things are perhaps arguably more equitable, or until we're not forced, we being all Americans are forced to check a box, white, Black, Asian Pacific Islander. I don't even know what the other ones are because I avoid that question altogether. But, you know, I think that is the challenge of the American experiment is we have these convenient narratives and the toxic echo chambers of social media, I will stand by it, are kind of exacerbating that challenge. I don't like being hyphenated. I prefer not to, but when you get the from, you can only say where you're from so many times before you just start to hyphenate it. And then I could say Arab American because let's just be real, being a Palestinian American versus an Oh, that's where it got cut off. Did you see that? See? Coincidence. Just saying. Steve, over to you, please. No, I'm just kidding. But so I guess that's where I stand on the issue. And I'll just finish by saying, you know, in my experience with state and local governments and law enforcement, which has been the greatest joy of my still life happening, I'm not, you know, ending it here. You know, I think if this isn't the group and if this isn't the program to have those conversations on how we take the narrative back and how we use academic and science and rigor around the American, if not, then
Your microphone keeps cutting out a little bit.
conveniently.
So it's interesting, you know, this question is about what do we feel about assimilation? And I think it goes back to, you know, you talk about hyphenated. Your hyphenated word, but when you first started speaking, you said something very important that I think ties into my answer for do I feel it's important for people to assimilate into the American patriotic view, the American society, and push toward a stronger, cohesive America. As you said, I want to live in my country, this country. And my view of assimilation is exactly what you just said, that you have now you feel you're part of this country, which is important. So I think the strength, and I'd said it before, the strength of America comes from the multicultural, the multi ethnicities that are coming here. They're bringing so much skill, talent, diversity of thought to the United States, and that's the strength we have of America. Just because you assimilate into the American view of patriotism or defense of this country, or you say, hey, this is going to be my country, I now care about it, I'm now willing to sacrifice to defend the values, and I think we're one of the only ones that have freedom and loyalty, freedom and, I think it's freedom and loyalty as part of our key values, that they're willing to defend that is important, because just because you assimilate into it doesn't mean you lose your cultural aspects, that you're Palestinian.
Cultural identity.
Your cultural identity. Again, it goes back to my big concern that we have, you know, whether it's the echo chamber of social media, whether it's certain politicians, you know, going toward, you know, their funding base. You know, we feel that there's way too much divisiveness out there, and again, pushing us toward that tribalism, you know, and that is just a dangerous slope we're going down. So yeah, I do think it's important. I do think that you feel you assimilate into this. I'm going to answer for it, but when you start off saying that you're part of this country, that answers my question right there. I think that's important that people feel that way. They may hyphenate. You know, I could say, you know, I'm a Norwegian American, but I understand. Well, when you talk about the consensus, that's a different story. But I do think it's important for this experiment, and we are still a very young experiment to succeed. There has to be some assimilation.
And that's one of the great points about why patriotism in the United States can and has to endure, because we're not one ethnicity. We don't have that stream we have a common language, but that's only because it's written in our documents. We have 400 languages that are spoken routinely in the United States, and nobody cares until they care, right? The data will tell you within 3 generations, the host language is lost, and English, American English, becomes the predominant language. And the other thing that's unique about the United States is, depending on what you read or what you believe, we're 11 nations in one. Given a set of circumstances, New York City and the Dutch, New Amsterdam is completely different than Yankeedom, which is the Northeast, and New England, which is different than Tidewater, which is different than the Deep South, which is different than the Midwest, which is different from El Norte in California. So when you start looking at it collectively, I don't know what assimilation looks like, but I think we're doing a pretty good job, right? Because it's not a case of coming to, no, jump in there. There's not that's one of the challenges we face. Is there one way, or are there many ways, and we just kind of figure it out, and it's an immersive thing as opposed to a stated thing?
No, I'm just messing with you, Dan. So look, I don't know that I'm on this assimilation bandwagon. I'm gonna be real with y'all. I believe in integration over assimilation. I have yet to see. I could see how assimilation has its benefits, and I guess my argument is, what are we assimilating to? Like, what is that standard? Again, it implies that there is this correct standard that we are all assimilating to. The Indian Termination Act, which again, not long ago, was it 70s, 60s? Someone can correct me, I'm sure. But the Indian Assimilation Act basically took thousands of acres of land away from indigenous people reservations because we were trying to do more assimilation. What that resulted in was extermination. I don't know that exterminating a culture is the same as assimilating a culture, which is the same as integrating with a culture. I offer that the salad bowl method is probably more palatable for me than the melting pot. I don't want to lose. I don't guess whatever I came here with. Again, I was born here, so came here from here. But I don't want to lose that either. I just worry that the idea that we're assimilating to something, if we're assimilating to each other, great. I'm here for that. But again, what is that each other? What is that standard requirement that we're all assimilating to? Is it what our founding fathers did? I'd like to vote. So I don't want to assimilate to that. So I guess, I'll leave it there, but I'm just putting it out there that I'm team integration, not team assimilation.
So you're making the comment that we can't assimilate in reverse, and that we're progress, and we're moving to something unknown,
I hope
undefined. But that's what you were saying.
Yeah, I hope we're moving towards something as opposed to assimilating back to something. Yeah.
So to kind of roll that through, in a letter from George Washington to James Madison on November 30th, 1785, Washington wrote, "We are either a united people or we are not. If the former, let us in all matters of general concern act as a nation, which has national objects to promote and a national character to support. If we are not, let us no longer act a farce by pretending to do it." On the one hand, that sounds really noble, and on the other hand, it sounds completely what you said. What are we? Are we the amalgam of all the things we bring to this? Again, you get back into your John Boyd stuff and your OODA loop, and your orientation is unique to you. So are you capable and have the capacity enough to recognize that you are a culmination of everyone that came before you in your life, and how you interface and what you believe and your belief system versus your value system? And is this the daunting problem that it was 1918, 1920, Bolshevism and taking away people's civil liberties and destroying people and locking people up for failure to comply? Or have we made some incremental change? Right, so that comes back to that next kind of series of that amplification and acceleration question, are we being played? Are we responding to external factors in the AI space, in the cyberspace, in the social media space? Are there national actors accelerating and amplifying some of these differences to hasten our demise? Or are we just that consumed with the superficial and no longer a serious nation that we're actually feeding ourselves? Steve.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So I do think there is probably some credibility to some external sources probably affecting us through the use of social media, but I also think that at times we can be our own worst enemy internally. I really do. I mean, when you look at it, both with people, whether they're at home, they're being self-radicalized on social media. Look at it just in my short history with the Capitol Police. I came in there beginning of 2017. We have James Hodgkinson. He's on social media. He's getting radicalized with a lot of stuff that's anti-Republican. What does he do? He comes in June 2017 and attacks the national pastime of baseball and shoots up the Republicans down in Alexandria playing baseball. Then we have again people on social media looking at all the stuff percolating up with the threats of a stolen election and the claims of a stolen election. Then when you have politicians pushing it down from on top, it really can impact a society. We had it so January 6th, we have a rally down in Washington D.C. You have the president come out and say, hey, if you don't go up to the Capitol and fight like hell, you're not going to have a country to fight for anymore. Again, it's a dangerous thing when you have these people that are consuming all that stuff on social media, whether it's internal, external, and then being activated to go up there. It creates a very dangerous environment, I think, for all of us. And like I already said, when you then, I had to deal with that, to deal with, the issues with the military, not wanting to respond, but that's a whole different one. But then you also have, like I said, June 2022, Biden having that speech. Again, you look at what's going on social media, that just reaffirms what people are seeing on social media. So it creates a really dangerous vortex that just keeps reaffirming itself and supporting what some of these people are thinking on social media. So I do think that we do probably have some external actors that are taking advantage of our vulnerability right now with the kids turning towards social media, towards some of these really odd places to get their media, and that's where they're kind of getting their news and develop their narrative of what they think patriotism is and what the future brings. So I am very concerned about that, but I do think there's both external and internal actors dealing with it.
So obviously you can tell we're pretty passionate. We have both convergent and divergent points of view on things, but that's what makes this a unique conversation. The reality is we're running out of time, and I want you to ponder, do we require patriotism to move forward? Do we have to love one another? Is there a capacity to grow as a nation to compete in the 21st century? Because in our current state of affairs, we may not be capable